Welcome to the webinar series, Innovation for SDGs, Inspirational Tools Towards Sustainability Challenges. This is an event organized by the sectoral hubs of the University of Girona in collaboration with the Global University Network for Innovation. I'm Rafael Garcia, Scientific Director of the Robotics Hub of the University of Girona and Professor at the Computer Vision and Robotics Institute. My research is based on underwater robotics and computer vision, and I'm particularly interested in how to get unmanned underwater vehicles to explore their environment and carry out independent seabed surveys. The sectoral hub of the University of Girona is a platform that has a clearly market-driven approach, and it's focused on transforming knowledge and technology into economic and social value. We promote knowledge transfer and innovation, trying to establish and encouraging strong relationships between companies and institutions and the research groups at the university. This event is another proof of the commitment of the University of Girona to take action in front of the emergency of driving the interest of our faculty towards tackling SDGs challenges, as well as interacting with different agents and detecting needs and opportunities, both locally in the area of Girona and worldwide. During 2 weeks, from the 15th to the 25th of March, top experts are exploring various topics related to SDGs and their achievement. The first part of the series started with 3 webinars related to sustainability and science, co-creation and responsible research, and the SDGs, as well as communication and advocacy for the 2030 agenda. Sessions covering more specific topics are taking place in the coming days, in the following days, trying to cover a vast array of disciplines and challenges. Each presentation will provide ideas to promote this knowledge transfer and overcome barriers regarding the achievement of the SDGs. We would like to thank you all for attending this webinar, and we encourage you to interact and share your ideas and thoughts as much as possible. Your perspective and your knowledge is more than welcome and will certainly enrich the discussions that we will have at the end. Before I introduce today's speakers, let me share some brief organizational information for a smooth running session. First, a brief reminder about the session being recorded. So once the session is finalized, it will be uploaded to the event's website. If you feel like asking any question, just feel free to write your questions for the panelists in the Q&A section. They will be shared with the speakers after the presentation at the end of the speeches. And we also encourage you to spread the event in your social media by using our hashtags UDG4SDGs and GUNI SDGs, and our Twitter profiles Robotics UDG and Campus Patrimony. You may find this information in the chat. And without further ado, let's introduce today's first topic and speaker. Similar to the rest of living forms over thousands of years, humans have been freely exploiting natural resources and dumping their wastes into natural ecosystems out of control. However, during the last centuries, we developed new technologies that allowed us to improve our success as a species. Our unique abilities allowed us to exploit all kinds of natural resources, colonize all corners of the planet, and achieve incredibly high survival rates and long lifespans that led to a world population of almost 8 billion people. However, nowadays we have no choice but dealing with the aftermath of having taken ecosystem services for granted so long without realizing that nature could be overwhelmed and jeopardize our own wealth. This is the time when the use of all our ingenuity to tackle the threatening challenges that our own development poses to us becomes compulsory. So under the title Robotics4Nature, Disruptive Technological Approaches to Tackle Conservation Challenges, the contrasting and inspiring presentations of Rebecca Noebel and Andra Keay will highlight emerging opportunities as well as unveil challenges to reflect upon and pave the way for future innovative projects. Rebecca Noebel is a researcher at the Ecologic Institute Berlin. Her work focuses on the loss of biological biodiversity and its respective policy frameworks. She currently supports the Institute's work for the European Topic Center on Biological Diversity, inter alia regarding the reporting under EU birds and habitat directives for the State of Nature Report 2020. In this context, she is also involved in activities targeting the implementation of the biodiversity strategy for the 2030, specifically focusing on European protected areas, such as drafting the Digital Protected Area Report for Europe. So I think, Rebecca, we have all the audience waiting to listen to your thoughts and ideas, and the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, Rafa. I hope you can see my screen already. Yes, it works.
Yeah, we're able to see it. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, thank you also for the invitation for today's really interesting webinar. So as already mentioned by Rafa, I will start the presentations with the overview of the results of the state of nature in the report, which was published last year. And I have to see when. Does it go forward? No, I think now. Okay, thank you. Within this presentation, I would like to give first a brief background on this really great body of work, which was executed last and years before. And then I would look into the results and looking specifically into the results for the birds and the other species and habitats, and also look into the results of reported pressures at EU level. Then concluding, I will also give a brief overview of the remaining challenges and the upcoming incentives also on EU level. So this is on the right side, you can see the report, which has been, as I said, published last year in October by the European Environmental Agency with the support of the European Topic Center on Biodiversity. And as it's like, as I said, a really huge body of work, I would like to focus on three chapters of the report, which is focused on the status and the trends of the birds, habitats and species, and on the pressures. As a background, the reporting under the nature directives is already it happens every 6 years by the member states, and it's relating to the two nature directives of the EU. It's the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, and the Birds Directive already is over 50 years old, and when the Habitats Directive also came into place, these two requirements for the EU member states to report on the current status of their habitats and species, as well as on birds, were synchronized. So now we have a synchronized reporting of these two directives every 6 years. And it's like the results which are presented are kind of comparable, but however, there are some differences also. As you see, we have the conservation status identified as good, poor, or bad, or also unknown. for both the birds and the other species and habitats. But it's for the birds, it's more the population status oriented according to the IUCN red list criteria, which is not the case for the species. And I won't go into detail on this really huge assessment, which is based on a variety of different parameters and assessments. And but these are like the four main categories in the results. The further background is can also be shown by this really interesting and comprehensive graphic. So as I said, it is a report from the European Environmental Agency, and it consists of like three main stages, which is either on the located at the national level or the EU level. And on national level, you would first have the data collection for all naturally occurring birds in the EU, and also for selected habitats and species types, which are, for example, more than 1,000 different non-bird species. But it is interesting, it's just like a selection of particularly variable habitats and species, and it's not the entirety of all habitats and species as compared to the Birds Directive. This data collection is a huge challenge also, and it is executed by more than 200,000 people which are active in this field, and which are collecting data, and also for more than 3,000 people that are only processing the data and making that sure that the data is consistent among the country and also for the preparation for the EU. And it is also interesting to know the fact that this is like that there's more than 50% of the people involved. They're on a voluntary basis. So this is done by a lot of encouraged and nature enthusiasts, which is really great, I think. So then the second stage is the reporting processing, which is also done on national level for the birds, the assessments, to be able to provide the reports for the EU. This is done following specific guidelines from the EA. And then the data goes into the central EA data repository. On EU level, then we conduct further EU level assessments, aggregating all the national reports and the results on member state level to have further assessments for birds, habitats, and the species. There's further quality control and assurance, and also interesting summary sheets. And you can also, there's also a great collection in the web, actually, if you're interested to see all the results there's, because which I will going to present here is just like a fragment of all the data available and created. So coming to the results, I start with the birds. And the assessment shows that more or less half of the bird species have a good EU status, population status. And it has to be said that it's less than the last period, which was above 50% still. And it also has to be said, which is not on the it can be seen here on the page, but that the bad conservation status also increased by 7% compared to the last period, which is partly because of a mixture of changes in the surveys and analysis methodology, but also due to genuine deterioration of the status. There's also assessment on short-term and long-term population trends, looking at different timescales, where you can see also that you have increasing degree of unknowns in the long term, but also you can see that you have increased positive trends or increasing trends, but also increasing deteriorating trends, which is there's also some uncertainty about it, in fact, because of the large proportion of unknowns. And also to have some examples here, there are some breeding species that are increasing across EU member states. And these are most likely water birds. And there are also lots of breeding birds which are decreasing among most of the member states. And these are most likely to be farmland birds, which is like one of the key results also of the report, that farmland birds are particularly affected, as well as bird species that are reported under Annex 2, which is in fact, this is like the category of birds which can still be hunted in some countries. So huntable species are also more likely to be affected and have more likely decreasing population status. Looking at the results for habitats, these results show that the conservation status is not as positive as for the birds, with not only 15% of habitats assessment having a good conservation status, and over 80% are either poor or bad. Compared with the previous reporting period, the share of habitats with bad conservation status also increased by 6%. And habitats particularly affected are dunes, bogs, and coastal habitats, which have like a poor or bad conservation status for more than 90% of the cases. And in this reporting, the reporting also looks at the trends of this status, and though in some cases it also improves, most likely is this further deteriorating and or stable. This is best for, I think the forests are leading here with most improving trends, but it's not, in fact, when you do the math, it's still more deteriorating than improving. The Atlantic region is the most affected region, in fact, in Europe, as it covers over 100 different habitat types and over 15 plant and 80 animal species. It is highly populated and also subject of a lot of urbanization processes. So that pressures are really high on this region, affecting particularly dunes, for example, which in case for the shifting white dunes, the poor or bad conservation status is predominant in 8 of the 9 countries where this habitat exists. Coming to the results for species, these in the mean on the European level, you have around a quarter of species having a good conservation status, which is also an increase compared to the previous period by 4% as compared to the habitats where it's decreasing. But presumably it is just due to changes in the methodology and the variations in the quality of data. So you can't really say that this is a genuine improvement. While the reptiles and vascular plants are quite well off still with the assessment, fish and mollusks and also vascular plants are particularly affected over averagely. And this can also be seen, for example, for reptiles and their trends. They don't have any improvements really. It's just stable or further deteriorating. And also for fish, the deteriorating trends farly surpass the improving trends. So this is all kind of depressing also, because these conservation efforts have been going on for really many years in the EU. So looking at, from a different angle at the results on species, we also have like a distribution map showing the predominant conservation status on the map. And there you can also see that particularly in the marine areas, for example, on the Baltic Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, you have many conservation status assessments as unknown, or not, sorry, as bad. This is also due to that this map just did not show, excluded the unknowns. So much of the species conservation status assessments are unknown in fact, but if they're not, they're most likely to be bad. This is, for example, the case for the harbor porpoise, which is reported as having a bad conservation status in all the 4 member states, which you can see for the Baltic Sea, marine Baltic. And for example, also for the leatherback turtle in France and Greece. And for the fin whale, for example, this is a species where, except for Ireland, all the reports are unknown. So coming to the reported pressures, this really, it has been identified that agriculture is the predominant pressure for most of the species and the habitats, with over 20% of all pressures reported related to agricultural activity. And this is still excluding pollution, which is also pointed out separately, because this is something that the member states report in as a different category. So agricultural management, intensive grazing, general intensification is a huge pressure. As I said, also for the Atlantic region, urbanization and also leisure activities and tourism pose large problems and pressures for many coastal habitats and marine species. You also have the modification of water regimes, such as physical alterations of water bodies or removal of sediments. Also hydropower plants, which predominantly affect the freshwater habitats and fish. For birds in particular, you also have the problem of illegal killing and hunting. And this, actually, I was astonished by the number, but you have annual hunting back for legally hunted species, birds, in Europe being over 50 million birds. It's country dependent, but I think it's a really large number. You also still have the forestry for forest habitats as one of the main pressures, and also impacting woodland species, for example. One pressure which was not so predominant in the recent report, but was positioned as a major threat in the future was climate change. It's really seen as a rising threat, particularly due to the changes in the temperature and also decrease in precipitation, leading to droughts, which also affects the composition of habitats and the distribution of species, for example, leading to different ecosystem compositions. Yeah. And this is also kind of related to another emerging and rising pressure and threat, as being the invasive alien species that particularly, for example, affect dunes and scrubs, and also breeding seabirds that are also increasing by the destabilizing climate conditions and different temperature patterns. As of now, I would just like to go into detail into two of the reported pressure categories, which is first the agriculture, to just really look what are the most predominant pressures and impacts for the different groups, the habitats, the birds and non-bird species. So for habitats, the abandonment of grassland management and intensive grazing is really predominant, affecting natural grasslands, semi-natural grasslands, and also therewith the pollinator species, which are also highly affected by the intensification of agriculture, by, for example, the conversion to more intensive agricultural usage, by drainage activities, or the removal of small landscape features. And also birds are particularly affected by these kinds of changes from one type of natural agricultural land to another. For the second one, I would like to just briefly look into the exploitation of species pressure group, which, as I already said, is really also highly affecting the birds by illegal shooting and also the legal hunting, as shown by the hunting bags. And habitats are specifically impacted by the management of fishing stocks and game, as well as the shellfish harvesting, for example, really by using large trailers and disturbing the sea and marine habitats. For non-bird species, but also bird species, bycatch and incidental killing is also one reported pressure, which is not predominant, but for some species really affecting the populations. Yeah, now I already come to the conclusions. The report points to the fact that despite really significant efforts by member states and also some improvements which could be shown, the deteriorating trends are further predominant, and that the biodiversity in the EU continues to decline at a really significant rate also when you compare the results from the last period to the current one. The EU published their new EU biodiversity strategy for 2030 last year, and it has quite ambitious goals, but it also needs to be more effective and successful to protect the remaining biodiversity in the EU. And it also needs to ensure improved implementation on the ground. So for this, there are some main requirements which I list below, which are, for example, coherent and strategic cross-sectoral engagements, not only like with the biodiversity lens, but also with the linkages to agriculture and the energy sector, for example, among many other sectors, just like construction. Also, which is also part of the strategy, which are binding biodiversity targets and improved monitoring of them. And the monitoring is one aspect which is also quite highly linked to the following discussion, which is also really interesting. This is under development, and it's been done via expert opinions, or as I told you, the citizen science, for example, and these are like in situ data, and also by modeling in some cases. But it really depends, and it's not really systematic across all member states, and it is highly diverse. And it really depends on the last point, on the financial and human capacities on the ground in the countries. And this is also something which is intended to be tackled by the new strategy, but it still needs to be implemented systematically and consequently. And I would like to close with a really nice and comprehensive citing of from the executive director of the EEA, Hans Brunings, which he said at the publishing date from the State of Nature report, as he said that our assessment shows that safeguarding the health and resilience of Europe's nature and people's well-being requires fundamental changes in the way we produce and consume food, manage and use forests, build cities. These efforts need to be coupled with better implementation and enforcement of conservation policies, a focus on nature restoration, as well as increasingly ambitious climate action, specifically in the transport and energy sector. So with this, I would like to close for now. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I'm really happy to answer them. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for your presentation. Now, before we move on, since we have a question by Josep Vila in the Q&A section, remember for everybody, if you have any question, you can use the Q&A section. The question is, what do you think, Rebecca, about the role of common agricultural policy in relation to the state of nature in the European Union? So
yeah, this is a key, I think a key point, which has been also, like the development has been quite disappointing also, because with the new president, Ursula von der Leyen, she also, like, it was one of her main goals to set up a comprehensive European Green Deal, which has intends to really do the achieve this challenge to merge all the sectors together and have like a holistic approach to more sustainable development. But it seems that some parts of these sectors are still quite independent and are really influential. So there was like the Green Deal and then the biodiversity strategy, which makes also puts focus on, for example, the protection of pollinators on agriculture lands, or also the reduction on pesticides and many really good goals also on, for example, more ecological agriculture, more what do they say? Ecologic agriculture? Is it like organic agriculture? This is the word. Sorry. Okay. Then sorry when I'm a bit too broad, but then in the follow-up there was the new CAP discussions, which were really not at all in line of these ambitious goals. So now we have a new CAP for the next 7 years, I think, which is not really complementary to what the Green Deal and also the biodiversity intended to achieve. So this is now really hard already to achieve at the beginning of this stage due to this, I think, the really successful lobby of the large agriculture industry.
Great. Really, I'm looking forward to start the discussion on how technological approaches such as robotics and AI can help to tackle these conservation challenges, both in Europe and worldwide, since we have similar problems. But we have some few more questions. I'm going to save them for the end of the session. And I think we should keep on schedule. And since we have here Andra Keay, I would like to introduce Andra to you. She is the managing director of Silicon Valley Robotics, the non-profit industry group supporting innovation and commercialization of robotics technologies. Andra is a global ecosystem builder, futurist, a trained futurist, founder of the Good Robot Awards, Robot Lunch Global Startup Competition, Robot Garden Makerspace, Women in Robotics, and she's a mentor, investor, and advisor to startups, accelerators, and think tanks dedicated to growing ethical and equitable autonomous intelligence systems. She is also a visiting scholar at the UC CITRIS People and Robots Research Group. So Andra, thank you very much for being here with us. And again, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive introduction. Yes, anything with robotics in the title is something that I'm incredibly curious about. And I'm curious about it from the perspective of these are the technologies that are changing the 21st century. And how do we make sure that everybody is at the table? And how do we understand the directions that these technologies will be going in? And so I really want to thank you for inviting me today, because from the very start, this event is shaped around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I really appreciate, because one of the Occam's razor test that I have for whether or not a robot is a good idea is it going to be improving our lives in terms of one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? If it isn't, then that's maybe not such a great idea, even if you can get investment for it. So we get a lot of bad press in the Silicon Valley region for developing a lot of technologies that, you know, maybe aren't that necessary. There's a famous quote saying, I wanted flying cars, I got 140 characters, which is referring to the difference between fundamental technologies that are going to change not just our world, but our solar system, compared to a social media that doesn't seem to have any positive impacts at the moment. So you can see why robotics is both very interesting and very, very important. It is the 21st century technology that will make a difference. And so if we steer it towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals, then we're doing a much better job from the very get-go. So I love the focus of this discussion, and I really appreciated the broad and yet specific information that Rebecca has given us, talking about the perspective in the EU for nature. And hopefully robotics is going to play a little bit of a role there. But as you can tell, I'm in the US, but my accent is Australian. So I'm probably going to speak primarily about Australian and US examples. And the challenge will then be to see, how did these translate? Can we take what we're learning about robotics in one of these domains and then apply it to the problems that have been very clearly outlined? Pardon, my voice is a little poor, and my laptop is got a mind of its own, which is not something that I had programmed into it, so I'm not happy about it. Now, let's talk. Okay. Let's have fun with the presentation. Let's go back to slide 1, which is the basic 4Ds of robotics, which we heard in the title. It's actually the 3Ds usually, the dirty, dull, and dangerous robotics. I say it's 4Ds because we should also add dumb. These are not just dull as in uninteresting robotics. These are inherently stupid machines. In fact, we've had 50 years of robotics. That doesn't meet the definition, the current definitional standard for robots. The entire robotics industry, when we talk about the robotics industry, has been built around building robots that are now too stupid to count as robots. And for me, this is one of the fundamental issues that I face in trying to explain the robotics industry to the rest of the world, and indeed to explain the rest of the world to the robotics industry. So in this talk, I'm going to talk firstly about what is the robotics industry and how you can make sense of what the 21st century robotics is going to look like and what it's going to be able to do. And then I'm going to talk about applications in nature with robotics. And at the end of it, I really hope that you will have a clear understanding of what robotics is going to look like for at least the next 10 years, maybe longer, as opposed to what robotics has looked like for the last 50 years. So I call the first 50 years of robotics the Robotics 1.0 era. It is fundamentally different to what we're currently seeing. But the majority of what is called the robotics industry is still really just concerned with producing these robots. And I don't know why we're going to be doing this, but it might be necessary to have somebody else play the presentation. That the robotics industry, the 1.0 industry, it's worth a lot of money. It was a couple of years ago about 16 billion in direct revenue, with a total of approximately 50 billion in indirect revenue. So it is a sizable industry. And as such, it has its own directions. Now, 50% of this robotics industry is welding automobiles. It's not a very widespread robotics industry. It is focused in factories. It's focused in cages in factories, and it's focused on robots that don't shift away from their pre-programmed instructions. These are not robots that you can retrain easily, if at all. As said, 50% of the jobs that these robots do have been welding automobiles, and the other jobs have been doing dangerous machine tasks, tending machines, tending molten metals, doing some mining underground, deburring, a lot of very, I don't know how many people here have been inside a machine shop, but it's not generally a place that people are interested in going. It's the dirty type work, it's heavy work. And a small amount of this has become more precise and has been involved in robotic surgery, robotic consumer appliance assembly. But for every robot that there's deployed building a smartphone, there are tens of people. People are still far better at many of these tasks of assembly. So very often the robots have been saved for the jobs where it is simply too difficult and too dangerous to use people. Hence the 4Ds of the dirty, dull, dangerous robotics. I'm going to change slides, so I expect if you've got, we're going to probably change many slides. Yep. Right.
Okay, then maybe we can share from the host. So
yes, I think.
Rebecca, if that's the case, can you stop sharing the screen, please? Okay.
Yes. Now, of course, this didn't happen in our rehearsal. There were absolutely no technical problems whatsoever. And I really can only assume that my laptop has developed some form of autonomy and it really hates me today. You know, these are some of the interesting aspects of robotics that I'm not going to talk about today, but the way in which we anthropomorphize our technologies and the way in which we develop our technologies based on our anthropocentric kind of ideas can lead us into a lot of problem spaces. And so that's one of the other areas that I find of great interest in robotics. But I wanted to explain just a little more deeply this concept of robotics 1.0 and 2.0, because this is at the heart of being able to assess, can we go back a slide, of being able to assess what kind of technology you're looking at. Back another slide, please. I think 2 more slides. 1 more slide. Thank you. Okay. Oh, and forward 1 slide. We might be having the same problem everywhere. Anyway, so this concept is that we've had 50 years of robotics 1.0. These are fixed robots in factory cages. They are stupid. They are dirty, dull, dangerous, job oriented. They themselves tend to be large, dangerous, and dirty. Whereas today, from 2010 onwards, we have entered into a period that I call Robotics 2.0, and we see very little of this in any industry statistics. The reason for this, and I forecast that it will be another 50 years before we significantly shift into the 3rd era of robotics. Just, you might see outliers of it in the media, but that doesn't mean that it is making an impression on the world. Next slide, please. So how do we know what is making an impression in robotics? Well, as said, the definition of robot is changing. Next slide, please. Most of us had no trouble recognizing the first robot, but do you recognize this robot? And this is one of the key differences between Robotics 1.0 and Robotics 2.0. Robotics 1.0 robots helped build the car. The car is a robot. Now, it does not have full autonomy in most instances. Some Teslas claim to, but we believe that it's still a little bit short of full autonomy. However, within that car, there are many partially autonomous systems. This car has been built with robotics technology knowledge. And one of the things that we're starting to see is robotics systems distributed throughout our industries and our lives. They're not operating with any large level of autonomy. They're operating with partial autonomy to complete tasks when we send information or even suggestions. As some self-driving car specialists explained to me when I questioned them on this, really, my car is self-driving. I don't know how that could be. It's really quite stupid. And they said, after 2008, your transmission, your braking system, even your steering, you no longer have mechanical linkages. You're not in direct control of your car. You're sending electrical signals. And your car is now deciding what actions to take based on those. It's sometimes called drive-by-wire, but I find the fact that we've been able to, I find it actually really optimistic that we've been able to work out what are the things that we will allow a car to control in our braking, quite specifically, and then set that up. I think that's a deeper problem about self-driving vehicles than the kind of foolish trolley problem, which is another topic. But the point here is that we don't look at a car and see a robot. It's a product. It does the job that it is supposed to do, which is to be a car. In the same way, we don't look at many of our appliances, our washing machines, and say, oh, maybe that is a robot. It's a box, and we have an increasingly sophisticated set of intelligences and actions with inside that box. And the other way that we conceal a lot of the robots that are starting to ripple out in our lives is when we distribute the parts of the robot. So you have control happening over here, perception happening somewhere else, and then action somewhere completely differently. And at the moment, the standards bodies are scrabbling to try to come up with definitions of robots, because as fast as one group says, this is the definition of robot that works for us, another group says, but it doesn't describe what we do in our industry or what we need to address. So the standards organizations across the world do not agree on what robots are. So I'm giving you a very broad, next slide please, idea about what a robot is. And I'm telling you how to track it, how to understand where robotics is, because the Robotics 1.0 industry can be tracked by sales revenue, but not the Robotics 2.0 industry yet. The Robotics 2.0 industry is primarily tracked by investment data. The majority of these companies did not exist 5 years ago. Some of the earlier ones maybe have existed for more than 5 years and are starting to get revenue. And that's largely in the area of logistics and some advanced manufacturing. These are not just expansion on the Robotics 1.0 though. There isn't a linear progression from those 50 years of robots into the next group of Robotics 2.0. No, it's far more fundamental than that. Robotics 2.0 includes all of the cars that are increasingly autonomous. It includes all of the delivery robots that are leveraging the technologies that we've developed for self-driving cars. And it includes our planetary rovers. And one of the reasons that I picked this one was, aside from the brand match in the first slide, is that this is the signal of the increasing commercialization of a lot of these technologies. And this comes back to talking about it being investment dollars right now. And investment dollars are expecting to get a return within a shorter time frame than the government grant, research grant timeframes. So we're in a very interesting period where we're seeing the commercialization of a lot of new technologies that have not previously been categorized, that don't have past sales data. And this is causing the Robotics 1.0 industry to get tied in a lot of knots, because their categories of other unspecified are growing, well, at between 50 and 500%, depending on what data they're actually able to collect. It's a little bit like they used to be able to monitor the robotics industry because they knew who was building those robots and where they were used. Now, the number of companies building robots has increased exponentially. I've seen this happen in Silicon Valley itself. In 2010, we counted 60 robotics companies. In 2020, there are around 600. We've seen the investment increase. So it went from well under $1 billion in 2010 to $20 billion last year. Global investment, but a large amount of that is actually happening in the Silicon Valley region. We're usually home to around 1/4 to 1/3 of all of the global investment into robotics technology. So we're seeing a lot of the innovation. Now, global figures investing into robotics have been increasing. What you see if you track purely the investment data is that there is more and more seed stage funding for robotics companies happening around the world, but there are larger and larger amounts happening in Silicon Valley. And that speaks to two things. One is the companies that have the biggest, brightest, shiniest ideas are coming here to get the most money. But the other one is also that the Silicon Valley region is approximately 5 years ahead of the investment curve of everywhere else in the world. And that actually maps back over the last 15 years. When we see the growth of the investment in robotics, we see it started here first. and then has proliferated outwards. But what we're starting to see now is also what is called a consolidation. And I think consolidation is a really, really positive word, because that's where we're starting to get real commercial traction in certain areas of robotics. And that means that revenue is coming, and it's within 1 or 2 years. But these are in new categories. So I just want to reiterate again the idea that Robotics 2.0 is a fundamentally different category of robotics. Next slide, please. And rather than, when we see it in the media, we are often drawn to robots that do a very wide range of things, but that's not where we're at. Today's robots are focused on one task that they can do. Multitasking robots will be the Robotics 3.0 leap of the future. Next slide, please. And we've had a Cambrian explosion in robotics. This is, I thought it was a great example of an illustration of a Cambrian explosion in robotics, because we have both examples of the biological use of vision and the technological use of vision in this slide. So if you understand your evolutionary biology, you'll know that the current theory about the Cambrian explosion, that wonderfully fertile period in which the foundation of every genus of life evolved. So boring single cells, boom, Cambrian explosion, backbones of everything in a very short period of time. And the theory that this happened was the evolution of vision, fundamentally basic vision. And vision allowed life to find food more effectively. And it used to be that organisms effectively shuffled around, and they would be lucky enough to shuffle into a food-rich area, and that would be great. And if their food-rich area ran out of food, they would shuffle until they died. With vision, a lot of things developed. So whether you were predator or prey, vision is the most likely reason for the Cambrian explosion, biologically speaking. We're having a Cambrian explosion in robotics, and it is robotic vision. And when I say robotic vision, I'm incorporating vision as humans see, but also perception. Because for robots, there are other ways of seeing that can be just as effective. But this vacuum cleaner here, the first Roombas did not use vision. They did not use perception. They did not use intelligence. They were modeled on insect behavior. And the only sensors that they had were bump sensors to hit a wall and bounce off it. And they had a randomized path. That was good enough to vacuum a floor, because the path algorithms were sufficiently random and sufficiently calculated to guarantee that over a period of time, that robot would cover every aspect of the floor. And given that it was small, it was quiet, it could operate when you were out of the house, it met people's needs. People adopted it. The robot vacuum cleaner became a thing. 26% of all vacuum cleaners sold today are now robot vacuum cleaners. Now, 20 years ago, when this company launched, it was a very big thing. But now it is a fundamental, every single vacuum cleaner maker has a category of robot vacuum cleaners. But what's happened is that we've started adding perception. Those robots now map. They're expected to do a much more intelligent job. And next slide, please. I put this in because that Cambrian explosion is what is causing us to see robots of all sorts of shapes and sizes doing all sorts of jobs. And that's what I call Robotics 2.0. It is based on vision and perception. So it's based on sensors. These robots all have sensors. So I call it the 4 S's. These robots are smarter. They're able to make sense of their senses, and they're able to do it in real time. That is fundamental shift. Many of the algorithms that we use for navigation were developed in the 1970s with the world's first mobile robot, Shaky, at SRI International, the A-star algorithm, for example. But much of the work in computer vision and robotic vision has needed, for it to have a real impact in the world, we've needed to be able to do onboard calculations rather than use them as theoretical kind of tools. So having sensors and being smarter allows these robots to navigate. Navigation makes them safer. This is a fundamental difference between Robotics 1.0 and Robotics 2.0. Robotics 2.0 can include robot arms in factories, but they can be collaborative robot arms which can work safely alongside people, because through sensors, through software, through various safety mechanisms, these robots are now capable of detecting something unusual in the work envelope and taking avoidance behaviors. So I do want to reiterate simple tasks or single tasks. Just because we're getting a whole range of robots doing new jobs in new ways does not mean that we're ready to develop a multi-purpose robot yet. That will be, next slide please, a Robotics 3.0 thing. And let me show you what has happened in the last 5 years. In fact, just really in the last 3 to 4 years. This expansion in robotics has been so significant and rapid. Like your average industrial robot price tag is 25 to 125,000. And that's simply for the robot. The robot needs to be professionally installed and managed and serviced and maintained. So your starting price point for robots is now an order of magnitude more affordable. And we saw this with the popularity of drones in the around 2014. All of a sudden, drones went from being government-funded, Defense Force-owned vehicles to being something that hobbyists, cinematographers, agriculturalists could afford. The price drop as drones became democratized, is sometimes the word, was incredible. And so now your average person can get a high quality drone for between $1,000 and $10,000. And you can get a Christmas toy for $20. Now, the same thing has happened in robots. I'm mentioning 3 companies here who all have commercially available robots that together would add up to a full, practically, a fully functioning advanced robot system for less than $10,000. If all you need is a mobile base, then the Ubiquity robotics base can carry 100 kilos of payload, and it's capable, it runs on ROS, it's capable of autonomous navigation, it's capable of following markers. You can put like April tags, or QR codes in the environment, or it can use other visual markers, or it can identify people and follow people. You can play around with the sensors that it uses. And what it provides is a base that other people are launching various companies off. And in fact, on the weekend, a fashion designer is going to be launching a luxury robot drink trolley that has been based on this Ubiquity base. But, the pairing of somebody whose work is in fashion design, not robotics, with the ability to be deploying robots, That to me is groundbreaking. Next slide, please. Another example of this is an EU company. There are similar companies in China and in the United States. Some of these companies are getting bought up by large companies like Ocado and so forth. So I'm not certain how many are currently available off the shelf. But if you look for Automata or Haddington Dynamics or some of the other robot arm companies, they're around $6,000. And you're like, why is that more expensive than the mobile base? It's because these are aimed at industrial precision levels. You can get a hobby robot arm for a few $100s, possibly even less. I've got one myself, and it's a little disappointing because I have to keep recalibrating it. I like to set up some little demos, but every time I turn it off and turn it on again, things have slipped out of whack or something doesn't quite match up when it goes to work. And so this precision and reliability is a key component of commercialization of a system. And so the fact that we're starting to see entrepreneur and hobbyist price tags on things that are capable of commercial applications. Like I said, this is significant. And next slide, please. And what most robot arms don't come with is an end effector. That is usually custom selected for your particular application areas. And so when I talked about the average price tag of a robot arm, Robotics 1.0 being 25 to 125,000, well, the end effector is the same price. So you've got to double the price to get an arm that is going to do anything. Now, this from Sake Robotics is using 3D printing, but it's also a very, very smart design. It's being picked up by a lot of companies that are doing e-commerce, packaging, logistics work. And there are some very cool end effector designs that have become very affordable. And some of those include soft robotics, which is a wonderful area for the future. Next slide, please. But I really just wanted to let you know that robotics is now kind of off the shelf available. And often this has come about because pioneers who've created a community of practice. We've seen a few communities of practice in the drone community developing the autopilot as a community project, and the Open ROV community. It started as a Kickstarter, and this is technically not a robot because it's remote operated, but a community was inspired to explore underwater environments. And as more people got involved, as more work was done on iterating the robot build or the ROV build, then the price points reduce. And we see this increased utility developing as a technology becomes mature, as it is worked upon in many, many situations by many people. So the Open ROV community has, as a result, spawned many more projects. I think the link will be in the chat. There will be links to all of the companies that I'm about to, or projects that I'm about to mention, but I would like to caveat, I'm scratching the surface. These are the ones that I know something about, and it's by no means a complete survey of what's happening in the world of robotics. And what is fantastic is that what's happening in the world of robotics is growing so rapidly that it is getting hard to keep track of what's happening there. Next slide, please. This is a project from Australia. The Hotspot was originally called from Matthew Dunbabin at the Queensland University of Technology. And I want to talk a little bit about the Hotspot. It was called Hotspot for the crown of thorns starfish. And this is a long time coming, I will have to say. Sometimes you really need to be patient and passionate about what you're doing, because Matthew Dunbabin started working on some way to eliminate crown of thorns starfish from the Great Barrier Reef of Australia back in 2005. And he's been working in Robotics Vision, and he developed a computerized system that could identify the crown of thorns starfish with great accuracy. And identification was one of the first significant issues. Then he spent a lot of time working on ways to disable the starfish. And the primary methodology was centered around developing the ability to inject the starfish with toxins to kill it. And so what you can see on this picture of the hotspot is a deployable arm that, like a spearfishing robot, was able to first find the crown of thorns starfish and then inject toxin into it to kill it. And one of my biggest regrets is that I never saw the Great Barrier Reef when I was a child. Our family traveled to radio telescopes around the world, and there were no radio telescopes on the Great Barrier Reef. And of course, as an adult, the news from the reef is continually bad and getting worse. And I think, why should I go and see it now that it's been heat bleached and the crown of thorns starfish has devastated this? And more than half of the reef has been lost. It's probably worse than that. I find that very depressing. So it just makes me go, why didn't I go when I was a child and it was in peak bloom? But I am so grateful that people are trying to address restoring one of the world's great wonders of natural beauty. So crown of thorns is an invasive species as well. This is not a natural reef process. Now, the problem with the original idea of injecting toxins into the crown of thorns starfish is that they have 20 arms and the toxins weren't strong enough. And of course, you don't want to introduce toxins that are going to be dangerous for other life as well. But in 2014, they found out that a form of bile from cows and sheep, but just the stomach bile, has a particular constituent, is very, very good at killing crown of thorns starfish with one injection. Now, one injection from a robot, that becomes quite doable. So the hotspot projects received some grant funding to continue working on that. But the problem is that this is a big, heavy robot and it needs experts to operate it, as is so often the case with the research project. What is wonderful is that the success of the original work has led to an evolution of the design of this robot. So there is now the second generation and it's called RangerBot. Next slide, please. This is RangerBot. And you can see the difference in design, of size, of weight. And of course, weight is very related to how long or how far your robots can stay active or travel. So the improvements between the first hotspot and the RangerBot are significant. Now, as well as working on the crown of thorns starfish, RangerBot is now doing other jobs. So in this particular instance, it's LarvalBot. And LarvalBot is able to collect coral spawn. So it can pick up about 1.5 million coral larvae. And so just 2 or 3 of these robots can disperse a lava cloud, a coral lava cloud over thousands of square meters of damaged coral reef per robot per hour. So this is a significant opportunity to have an impact in the environment by really selecting the right kind of problem, but also having the perseverance to have spent years improving and improving on what was possible, to the point that we now have these wonderful ranger bots as an option for underwater use, as well as, of course, the open ROVs for citizen science and others in this area. Next slide, please. I want to talk briefly about Ocean One, which is the wonderful mermaid-like robot that you see here. And indeed, this is shots of Ocean One in the Mediterranean. And Ocean One was developed at partially at Stanford, and I think it was a cooperative. The original idea was tackling bleached corals in the Red Sea, but the trial run of Ocean One was archaeological. So Ocean One was deployed to be an avatar for a diver and to explore. In fact, in 2016, Ocean One was visited La Lune, which was the wreck of Louis XIV's flagship in the Mediterranean. Now, the professor controlling the robot was able to find a vase and extract it from the archaeological site and bring it to the surface with the same level of care and precision that a human diver could use. Now, the robot has two fully articulated arms. The tail section for the mermaid houses batteries and the computers and multi-directional thrusters. It's the hands that are significant on this robot. There's a fully articulated wrist with force sensors that give you haptic feedback to the pilot controls. So the human can feel whether or not the robot's grasping something firm or heavy or delicate, whether it's moving easily or whether it's stuck. And those are also not purely human in the loop. This is also routing through the autonomous systems so that certain key information about where grips were, where, how much pressure was needed, those things can be coordinated. Because imagine if you just suffer some communications drop, for example, boom, and you drop everything. No, this is the way in which autonomy works with people in the loop, so that the system pays attention to maintaining the things that are initiated by the human. And we've seen a lot of development of these kind of technologies through the surgical robotics world. And in fact, if you look closely at any robotics lab anywhere in the world, you'll find that they don't work on one type of robot project really at the expense of others. You will find the same person is working on robot suturing and is working on robot archaeology and is working on underwater robots and is working on robot algorithms for crowded movements within supermarkets. And that can be, in fact, that can be knowledge that is deployed back into human behaviors and controls. There's really interesting biomimicry feedback loops that happen in the study of robotics. Next slide, please, that I also find fascinating. So, I'm focusing largely on underwater at this stage, and I realized that we have already an expert in underwater robotics and vision moderating this panel. So I really encourage you to take your questions to Professor Garcia, who will be very up to date on what is happening. And here I just want to talk about the possibilities for aquaculture. One of the companies, there's two different robot fish pictured here. One is from Aqua AI, one is from Beaker, which is doing a crowdfunding for exploration, I think. I don't know much about that project, I will give caveat. Whereas Aqua AI have been developing their robot fish platform to provide fish as a service for aquaculture for a very long time now, and originally from South Africa. They are now deploying robots in Norway in fish farms to help protect the health of the fish. And one of the key takeaways that I've learned in the process of learning about what they're doing is that the fish are sensitive to foreign objects placed in their environment, whereas they are much less reactive to a robot fish. So a robot fish is a more effective monitoring system to get early understanding of the health within the fishing pen. And if you think about all of the ways in which your health monitoring is limited to afterwards, or when symptoms show, when fish are collected or caught, or when some other significant stage is reached in the process. And what we're doing right now is looking at what happens if we can insert our eyes or ears or other senses into the process at an earlier stage. And how can we make use of that information? Next slide, please. And one more example, this is one of the founders of the famous robot vacuum cleaner company, iRobot. And what he's working on now is a robot to help eradicate lionfish, which is another invasive species in the Caribbean, affecting the coral reefs anywhere. I mean, they're originally an Indian Pacific located species. And so now as they've spread through global shipping, the lionfish are now being very bad for reefs everywhere. Now, lionfish are potentially good eating. So what is really cool about this as an idea for the trapping and killing of the lionfish is that it's been designed in a way so that an entrepreneur can get a lionfish robot and go out fishing and sell their catch to a restaurant, if all goes well and lionfish are popular on the menu. So the idea is fundamentally about not just introducing technology from overseas or above, it's about introducing technology into the ecosystem, the human ecosystem around protecting the reefs and making a living off the reef ecosystem. And I think that leads us to the next slide quite well. Actually, we've got one more before that. But the point that I was, oh, no, next slide. The point that I was making about information capture means that sometimes the robot solutions often become very simple because people start with this idea of building a whole robot that's going to do all these things. And in the end, they discover that it's actually just getting the information and that maybe the robot part is not the important part. Or maybe it's just a case of let's drop off and pick up devices to collect information. And maybe now we can do that in places that we couldn't previously go, that were not as accessible for people, or that we couldn't scale the number of people that we needed to go and collect this information. And we know that our waterways, our oceans are some of the least well-known sections of the world. We know more about the surface of the moon than we know about the ocean environment, really. So there's a lot to be gained from increasing our knowledge And I think Conservify have created citizen available field kits for doing a lot of this type of work and drones to carry them. As said, these are just some of the many really interesting companies that are doing a lot of work, like conservationdrones.org, like werobotics.org. Next slide, please. So I'm speaking really about people and projects that I know more closely. And Drones for Good was a project from Drone Deploy. And again, this is talking about the way in which information is so important to us. The samples of projects that they are showing here include shots after the Santa Rosa and campfires in California, where people were able to inspect areas through drones. It's also showing the aftermath of Mexican earthquakes. And lest you think that things are always disaster related, it's showing the mapping of poor areas in some of the Brazil regions where it's simply not viable to get other technologies in to map. And so we're starting to see drones and robots becoming an important part of the toolkit for emergency response as well. And next slide. Some of my favorite projects. This is a project between the Indigenous communities in Australia and the Cape York Peninsula, and CSIRO, which is Australia's science foundation. It's spelt in a strange way. It's CSIRO. In Australia, we call it CSIRO. And also AI. Microsoft. Microsoft AI group. Now, the Indigenous population know the land, and they know the habits of the turtles on the land, and they would like to protect the turtles. With the addition of drone technologies that they can easily operate and the AI power from CSIRO and Microsoft, there's a much greater opportunity to spot nests and then go and protect nests, and to prevent the destruction in this really vulnerable time when the baby turtles are leaving their nests. So the project there is just to backtrack a little bit, the project and the drones are really key, because even the Indigenous rangers can't get into some of the areas of this territory. This is a really inhospitable area, and there's a lot of crocodiles, which are pretty nasty. So the technology is allowing monitoring in a far safer fashion. Now, it's opening eyes, not just to turtles, but to all of the other things that can be mapped. So, you know, in some areas there's eelgrass mapping, in other areas there's beach erosion mapping, dugong populations, seabird populations. Indigenous people are looking also at the use of drones technologies to record cultural heritage sites. And I think that's something that I'm not going to speak more about, but I really do want to raise that, because one of the key things here is that if we get the technology into the hands of Indigenous people, then they have the power to make decisions as to what is important to use that technology for. Next slide, please. So some of the things that are being done through various Indigenous ranger groups are monitoring burns and bushfires, and using burns to prevent bushfires. This has been a long-term cultural practice in Australia, and it has been largely ended in the 20th century, but it is quite interesting because the 20th century did not see the impact on the land that the Indigenous populations of Australia actually had. And the Indigenous populations have been in Australia for 70,000 years. It is one of the most long settled regions out of Africa. The dating is coming back more and more. More and more is validating the early beliefs that the Aboriginal ancestors had been on Australia for a very, very long time. And now there is new evidence of the coastal migration routes that were taken. So Australia was really one of the first colonized exodus areas. Now, what we didn't realize is that the Indigenous peoples farmed Australia. They were hunter-gatherers, but they changed the landscape for the hunter-gathering practices. And they are responsible for a lot of the diversity in the landscape. So in the 20th century, we believed that, okay, we stop all human activity on the land to restore it to natural. And what happened in Australia is that we ended up with landscapes that weren't diverse, that were quite monotonous, and that had very few species living in them. What happens with the intermittent burning practices for the Indigenous populations in Australia practiced allowed them to set the landscape to different levels of growth, which provided far more food and shelter for a wide range of animal populations, which allowed them to have greater food supplies for hunting and gathering. So it was a really large-scale farming practice that we didn't recognize as such. So the original goals to save Australia's landscape went off in a bit of the wrong direction. And what we're seeing right now is a new approach. In fact, there's now an Indigenous Protected Area program in Australia launched in 1997 and a Working on Country Indigenous Ranger program launched in 2007. And these are designating large areas, 70 million hectares, in fact. It's the largest protected zone of arid land on the earth. And there's around 110 Indigenous ranger teams. And they're engaged in managing the lands using technologies and using their wisdoms and practices. So for me, this is perhaps one of the most important things there. And the IPA areas are now 44% of Australia's preserved lands are now under Indigenous Protection Authority. Next slide, please. Next slide, yes. So the takeaway from this is that, firstly, we need to always get technologies into the hands of the people who are going to be most impacted and who can have perhaps the most profoundly transformative uses of the technology. We should not operate in a top-down approach. We need to understand deeply how the environment needs to use the robot solutions. But beyond that, navigation. Navigation is the key feature that robot technology has today. It's what is enabling so many new use cases. It is being made possible through vision and perception. And information is the lightest payload. So Information is the first use case to consider if you're thinking about developing robots for nature, followed by small and precise manipulations, for example, catching larvae or injecting starfish. And next slide, we'll just roll these through to the end. I didn't set my timer on time. Yes, there will be a Robotics 3.0, and we can see this already coming in research grant funding, but it's not commercializable in any significant fashion yet. I do see it as being about robot systems as well as multitask. Next slide, please. We can track it through research grants. Next slide, please. And I consider it to be multitasking, multi-agent systems. It will be more emotive, as in able to respond socially to us. Doesn't mean having emotions, just able to respond in an emotively intelligent fashion. And I think it will also be morphing, robots that can change shape as well as change task. And you'll see examples of that in soft robotics and in that fantastic robot documentary, Big Hero 6, that was based very, very closely on current research in robotics. Next slide, please. So go and enjoy Big Hero 6. And here's just a couple of shots. We might need to click on this slide for the videos to play. Here's some of the research currently happening in Silicon Valley that inspired Big Hero 6. On the left-hand side, you'll see the SRI International Microfactory robots, and they're capable of working in at least 140 plus, maybe more robots. They're very, very tiny, but they can assemble structures out of carbon fiber. And they can do this in vacuum and in all sorts of unusual places. And the inflatable robot that you see there, we probably need to click on it to make it move. It's just like a balloon. And this is work out of Alison Okamura's lab. But there are a number of other companies that are working on very cool things in soft robotics. And this just shows you a little example. That robot can deform itself to go through tiny gaps. And it can perform tasks in the environment, very simple kind of ones, but it can, for example, extinguish a fire, and it can send cameras into new locations, or in that instance, it can, it has a great power to weight ratio. So you could use it in some disaster situations. You're effectively putting a pump inside something, and that can then pump rubble away. So there are some fantastic things coming in Robotics 3.0. It is largely all research grants now. Next slide. And I believe that's the end of the presentation. The key points were navigation, information, and very, very targeted manipulation is what we can do with robots and AI. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andra, for this wonderful presentation. Let me start the Q&A session just with a comment, which is that now that we are hosting this in Girona, and you mentioned the Ocean One by Osama Khatib and the team at Stanford, that they went to La Lune. One of the robots that we have here in Girona is Girona 500, which is a robot that we took to La Lune in 2011. For mapping the shipwreck, we had a very loose idea of where the coordinates of La Lune were. We went there with the Department of Archaeology of the French Department of Archaeology with Michel Lourdes from the French DRASM, and we had to map a bigger area until our robot found the shipwreck, and then from the map that we built from the shipwreck, this was used the next summer 2012. For doing the excavation of some of the parts of La Lune, and in fact this was a documentary on National Geographic that appeared later on. But it's funny because you mentioned also about the COTSbot and how COTSbot became RangerBot, and I think this is something that sometimes in the research field this is very hard, because in Europe, for instance, the system of research that we have. The European Commission is analyzing the result of the projects based on what it's called the TRL, the technology readiness level. And normally we end up, when we are doing research and innovation action, TRL is low, it's 4, 5, 6. And reaching a TRL of 9 for going to the market, it's really hard. And I like very much the fact that you started explaining this transition from going from the crown of thorns starfish, the first prototype of the university, and then getting to a commercial prototype, which is something that sometimes it's not easy. And this raises another question, which is what are we doing wrong as a community or as a policy, in fact, for the research that makes it so hard to get to the market once we do the research, which is
we have poor incentive structures because research, you are not incentivized for spending so long on developing reliability in a product. There's no publication results that you get out of that. There's no, your research grant funding will dry up. And there really needs to be a strong, this is sometimes called the chasm or the valley of death. And it is that period between the research grant and commercialization and investment, where trying to get some shift in the investment community, the increase in space investment, and perhaps the experience in some of the biofields are leading some investors in deep tech, science-based technology, to realize that the average timeline for an investment fund is 10 years. What if you need 20 years to really bring home a result? So we're starting to see some investors creating longer term goals, but really there is the sort of reliability that investors are looking for there is still that gap. That gap of 2 to 3 years minimum spent working very closely with, I'll call it the customer, but let's call it, it could also be the project, the crown of thorns starfish, just persistently working with, so what are the things that we still need to solve? We've proven that we can do this sufficiently for publication, but I can't pass this on to somebody else to use. And so I know universities try to solve
aspects. In fact, it's not only robustness, but it's also usability, like you mentioned before, and all and then how to drive this to the market in a proper way. That's certainly true. There's a question for you in the question and answer section. Let me go through it. It's from Ali. It says, since drones have been used a lot these days, especially for filmmaking and taking photos, which can be annoying for many people, what is your point of view about future policies, restrictions and rules for using drones in many fields, considering the public privacy?
That is an interesting question because there are many, many layers there. I think in some regards, privacy is going to be one of the least factors. Public safety will be the factor that shifts most of the regulatory movement. And I think we will look towards developing corridors, approved corridors for drone flight, and possibly corridors at different heights for different sizes. One of the things in the United States is the drones rapidly became a nuisance and a danger in the national parks and were banned. But the state parks and the state forests are all open. So there's still plenty of opportunities if you want to be flying drones. Cinematography is generally a use case that has to pay attention to safety and therefore, and has a history of getting permits for short use cases, and they can afford to do that. So it's been one of the industries that's been commercially successful. The other industries that largely have been able to utilize drones are, again, those industries that we don't see much of. So mining companies that have large areas that are difficult to access, where the information that they can gather visually is valuable. And that's the other thing, you know, how valuable is your visual information? And I see that there was also a question there about arms on robots. And that is still such a difficulty. It's like you have to have a really good reason for having an arm. There are things that you can do, and I use the word manipulation in the environment, but in the same way that the Cotspot, it has one action. It is a very specific action. And now the larval bot, and indeed the lionfish bot, they're doing a manipulation of the environment. They're taking an action, but it is a comparatively simple one. And we need to de-risk. You know, the more things that can go wrong on a robot, the more things will go wrong on a robot. And right now, arms are adding a degree of complexity that is that needs to be solving a very, very high value task to make it worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially if you have a manipulator, in the case of an underwater robot, and you are free floating with the waves and everything, and you want to grasp something or to inject, like in the case of the starfish, that's really tricky. And of course, this is a discussion we always have when we have people from industry that are used to use ROVs in the North Sea. That the first thing they ask is, and if sea state is 3, what do you do? Nothing. So there's we wait for the sea to calm down. We still need 20 years of research probably for going in this direction. Let me point you to another question for you, Andra, which is from Philip, saying you mentioned that there are only very targeted applications for manipulation with robot arms. Oh, this is the one of the arms that you said, and then he was asking about the challenges associated with it. I think more or less we touched.
I think cost is exactly it. We talked about how, you know, people in the oil and gas industry are quite familiar with using ROVs, whereas people in the conservation industry have less access and will definitely have access to less expensive ROVs. So you have to say, how valuable is that data, or how affordable can you make what you're doing? And so that's really where it's the Occam's razor. Can you achieve what you're doing in a more economical fashion? And the cheaper that you can make that, the wider you can spread it, which has other benefits, because then of course you're able to collect more information and make it more broadly available around the world. So, you know, I'm very much in favor of simplifying your solution as much as possible. And sadly, for some roboticists, I think I mentioned, they've come in with this idea to build a robot to do X, Y, or Z, you know, collecting rubbish from the beach or something. And the reality is the majority of the job can be done with a lot less of the technology. So you have to say, then what's going to have the biggest impact? Maybe what I need to do is focus on this. And in fact, there are many sensor companies and AI companies that have been developed from robotics companies who've just gone, well, we wanted to build all of this, but we couldn't get this part. Like, there's still such a need to get better perception or better control. So we've decided just to build that part. And that's looking at it more from the technology stack side of it. But certainly conservation is generally an area where the expense matters. And it's pretty good to do what you can with as low a cost as possible.
But in fact, it's exactly what happened with the vacuum cleaners you described before and the iRobot Roomba on the first case, which is, it was the first one that said, okay, I want to sell a vacuum cleaner that is going to be autonomous. Okay, it's going to behave like an insect and only with the bumper and so on. But I remember in a meeting in an European robotics network in Amsterdam, we had a meeting, and this was the first time someone from iRobot came. No one knew iRobot at the time, and he said, I want to sell a robot for $200, and that was his target price. And I remember he said, okay, you know, all the mechanical parts, consider in the bill of materials, you can consider it zero, because we're going to build so many robots that the cost per part is going to be just the plastic that we are injecting for building that part. And I think, and this is something that probably we're going to see also with the autonomous cars in the near future. So now some of them, not Tesla, but some of them are using LiDAR. LiDAR is a very expensive sensor right now, but if this reaches the mass market, the price of LiDAR probably is going to go down, and then we're going to see LiDAR being used in the forest and being used in for collecting data, like Rebecca was presenting before and asking or trying to find these links. Let me link with Rebecca on this context. From what you described on conservation and linking to what Andra was saying about the first thing is going to be information, collecting data, and then the second one will be then manipulation or collecting or taking samples or manipulating the environment. What do you think are the main challenges for in the evaluation of conservation?
I think it's really complex, and it's just a case by case usage case. Also, I think it's for example regarding the biodiversity monitoring on this large scale in the EU. I think this is still something which cannot be covered in a foreseeable future by such inventions as I imagine, but for like a small scale and also for some selected species, as you said, I think it's really interesting actually. Andra, thank you for your presentation, by the way. For example, for monitoring small species, remote species, which can be easily accessed, or which hide in dangerous areas, for example, which you also pointed out. This is something which can be, I think, used in some cases where it is also really significant, where you say, okay, this is a priority, we want to really have the information, and this is where we can get it. And it's also really interesting to tackle some pressures I mentioned, for example, as you said, with the robot arms on the sea with, for example, invasive alien species, as you pointed out with the what was it, the sea eels? I think so. Yeah. Or yeah, also to remove some disturbances or something like this. I think it's a really great option. Also, like to complement different parts of the process as well. And as you said, first information gathering and then the manipulation. I think there's also some can be used separately regarding the focus of the targeted use of such robotics.
It's connecting to the drones, in fact, to be used either for conservation or in any other applications. Andra, there's a question by Ali saying that another important thing to be considered is the flying birds and drones. So this will be a question for both of you. As a possible, drones being a possible threat or danger for birds. And he asks, is there any action or project to implement the artificial intelligence into the drones to be smart enough in order not to affect the flying birds in the sky?
We have such high expectations of the intelligence that we think we can develop and program into things. And there's no way, absolutely no way that we would be able to deliver that level of intelligence. What we're able to do is to do something to generally allow safe collision landing. When a drone loses engines, when a drone collides with something, when there's some problem, to kind of limp safely downwards. So it's kind of the least problem pathway, rather than the active, the drone as a drone or robot for that matter, as an active good citizen. We can't get that level. So what we need to do is have to always think about it in terms of how can we enable a mode that is going to be do the least harm possible type thing, as in reduce movement, reduce speed, reduce and remove from the area type thing. Interestingly enough, birds are being used to take down drones at some airports. The large raptor trials to be safety mechanisms to prevent unauthorized drone use around airports. And I do think that there will be effectively ecological pollution from our airways. I do think that this is a problem, so I'm really glad you raised it. But the answer is going to be in perhaps developing corridors and making sure that you have nature corridors as well. You know, is there a way for migrating populations to transverse across the landscape without getting caught into aerial traffic as well as ground traffic? So I think that's a discussion that we need to start having.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the additional potential impact of noises. Is this something which has also been already researched by? But I think because maybe it's just my perception, but the drones are sometimes really loud, and this does it affect, for example, passing birds or other species?
Yeah, we know probably people will get the worst of it because there will be the most use cases for drones to be doing things in an urban environment than not. There are already awarenesses, for example, to not have drone photography over certain areas that might be nesting bird populations or geothermal pools. Part of it is because of the danger of the falling as well as the noise. There's also things like, I believe, no-fly zones around whales. Although I'd have to check if that's actually valid from country to country. There's a lot of people take some really great photos, and there's a bit of discussion in the drone community itself about maybe the National Geographic or whomever else is doing these wonderful photography awards needs to be very clear about who is allowed to take those photos and when they're allowed to take those photos, rather than spawning people who go in without knowledge.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We could be talking for hours. I think it's really a topic that has this component of technology, of conservation, but now we are also addressing some ethical issues that we should that should be on the table too. I think we are running out of time, so it's time for closing the session. So first of all, I would like to thank our speakers, Andra and Rebecca. Thank you very much for helping us out here. And thank you very much to all the people that are still staying with us for attending this event. It has been an enlightening and fruitful session. I hope you find it interesting and inspiring to some of you, so that you can get involved in some of these challenges and contribute to improve this world. The next session will be scheduled for tomorrow from 11 to 1 p.m. CET. And we'll cover the topic of improving sustainability of the food production system along the entire value chain. You'll have the link provided in the chat, and your attendance will be more than welcome. We hope to see you in the next session, and thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.